Well, hello there. My name is Sarah, and I am reading a ghost story called Secret City by Jan Andrew Henderson. We're now up to chapter 7, The Dungeons. Charlie hurried back to the guest house, his mind in a whirl. Like the last time he'd opened Peasel's diary, the boy was not sure if he'd imagined or actually witnessed the events in the past. But there was no doubt that he had actually seen a hawk, right here and now, identical to the one that Duncan described 2 centuries ago. Perhaps the bird's descendants still nested in the same area, and by some genetic fluke, some bore the same markings. Then again, maybe all hawks around here were white with black-tipped wings. Duncan didn't seem to know much about the lowland wildlife of Scotland, and neither did Charlie. Anyway, the boy had more pressing questions. How had Shadow Jack Henry's well come to be blocked up, hidden under a pile of rocks along with Peasel's book? What was the mysterious rapping that he'd heard in the underground city, and what exactly happened to the boys from the past? By the time Charlie reached the guest house, his parents had left for their nightly performances at the big top. A little tray of biscuits and tea bags were provided in each room, so the boy grabbed a handful of chocolate digestives, opened the journal, and lay down on the bed to read. The next Sunday, we arranged to meet in the afternoon once more, as Duncan had gone calling on his lady friend again, and he seems to be creature of habit. I was bored waiting, and knowing that the castle esplanade was filled with gentlemen taking the air, I vowed to lighten a few of their back pockets before returning to see my friend. Edinburgh Castle was on the highest pinnacle of the old town ridge. The muddy road that led up to it was steep and slippy, and Peasel was wheezing like a donkey long before he reached the top. Eventually, the slope opened onto the castle esplanade, an exposed area leading to the huge iron portcullis that fronted the massive fortress walls. Since the other 3 sides of the castle overlooked sheer cliff faces, the esplanade was the only real way to reach the castle, which left potential invaders horribly exposed. It was said that an approach was exactly the length and that an arrow could be accurately fired. In peacetime, however, the esplanade's tremendous height made it the perfect spot for sightseeing, and now the area was filled with young men trying to impress their lady friends by wearing their Sunday best and pretending to know the names of the far-off hills. Peasel strolled around like the city's scruffiest tourist, secretly eyeing young men buying cups of flavoured ice for their paramours and watching where they kept their purses. A fool and his money are soon parted, and love makes a fool of the wisest men, the pickpocket said sagely. Oh, I must write that down. While Peasel was spying on potential victims, Duncan sat at the bottom of Blair Street, listening to the gypsy girl as she sang to the crowds. Like so many of the old town's narrow winds, Blair Street sloped steeply down from the high street until it vanished into the slums of the Cowgate at the bottom. Each wind had its own distinct character, and this particular thoroughfare was lined with bookstalls and filled with what Peasel always referred to as learned gents browsing idly amongst the leather-bound volumes. Near the bottom of the wind, the stalls thinned out, and there were gents paused to listen to the gypsy girl, for she had a voice that seemed to make the words sweeter than any book could. This time, however, her tune was making Duncan melancholy. A lament about the clans forced to leave their homeland after the doomed Highland revolt of 1745. Even the girl's name reminded him of the Highlands. Heather. Halfway through a refrain, Heather noticed Duncan's expression and broke off in mid-tune. She picked up a few grubby coins, and to the disappointment of the gathered gents, she came and sat beside him, her thick black hair swinging across her face as she lowered herself down. "Is my singing making you sad?" she said, looking sideways at him. "The song is," he replied, "and all the more for being sung so beautifully." "If you miss the Highlands so much, why did you leave?" Heather asked. "If I might be so bold," she added quickly, for she knew that the Highlander wasn't one to reveal his feelings casually. But Duncan answered without any prompting, for the song had also reminded him of a great injustice, and he felt that injustices should always be brought into the open. "The land my clan had worked for generations was taken from them, so the laird could use it for his sheep to graze," he said, with an undisguised disgust. There was nae work any more for the men who lived there. I'm sorry, said Heather, but Duncan hadn't finished. An outbreak of cholera 5 years ago killed many, my own father included. The rest of the clan booked passages to North Carolina to start a new life in the Americas. Hyland's face was expressionless. My mother wouldn't go. Why not? There was a long silence before the boy spoke again. I had a brother, little more than an infant. Ma used to leave him in the doorway of our croft, wrapped in a wee tartan shawl while she picked wild berries. I was supposed to be watching him. I looked away for only a few seconds. I swear. He kept his head bowed, but the gypsy could hear his pain, cracking his voice. When I turned back, he was gone. Heather covered her mouth with her hands. I thought it must be a wolf or a starving dog that took him, but I searched the moorlands for days. It's no use. Duncan's voice had suddenly grown hard and flat. Ma would not accept that. She said my brother had been taken by the little people. The fairy folk. Heather nodded, unsurprised. In those days, people still believed in such creatures. Aye. My mother died herself of the cholera some months after, but until that time, she stood in the doorway every night at dusk and called my brother's name, hoping the little people might take pity on her and bring him back. He looked up and smiled forlornly. They never did. Pretending to stare at the view, Peasel stretched out his hand and slowly lifted the tailcoat of the young man to his left, who was chatting animatedly to his lady. A stiff breeze blew from the Pentland Hills across the esplanade and tore at the youth's clothes, making the pickpocket's practice manoeuvre almost impossible to detect. The wallet slid out of the back pocket, vanished into Peasel's vest, and the pickpocket gave a satisfied smile. The young man was so engrossed in his bell that Peasel could have stolen his underwear. As the boy turned to escape, the grin froze on his lips. 2 kilted soldiers stood behind him, pointing their bayonets at his stomach. Heather sat silently beside Duncan, and for a while she allowed the Highlander his own thoughts. Eventually, however, she spoke again. Do you think the little people took your brother? Dinna ken, Highlander sighed. At our clan gatherings, the old men used to scare us with stories about them. It was the same with us gypsies, Heather agreed. According to our elders, the little people have many names. Elves, fairies, sprites, imps, pixies, brownies. Our legends say that they all used to live all over the world. But as the men began to spread across the globe, so the little people returned to their homeland of Galhadria. The girl lowered her voice, as if some unseeing being might be listening. They said that in the quiet places of the earth, the Galhadrians sometimes return to dance or hunt, and it's a great misfortune for any man to come upon them. Duncan was familiar with this part of the story. Children in the Highlands had long been warned of thin places, remote valleys and hilltops where the barrier between this world and the domain of the little people were closest. Though he had never heard the name Galhadria before, in these thin places, you might accidentally stumble on the little people dancing in the moonlight, and if you did, they would take you to their world against your wish. It wasn't that the little people were evil. The old ones of the clan would say it was just that the wishes of men didn't mean that much to them. Duncan supposed that was why they could take a human baby without worrying what it might do to a mother or a brother. We were told that the little people sometimes take our children and leave one of their own in its place, he said. And you can't tell if it's really one of the fairy folk until it grows up. Or sometimes they leave a horribly deformed changeling, or they didn't leave anything at all. I wish I knew what was true. He looked round at Heather. What's the matter? The gypsy girl was looking at the ground, her fists clenched. Nothing, she answered quietly. I just think that legends can get mixed up over time. Even a small mix-up can change the meaning of everything. Heather paused, as if she had more to say, but before Duncan could press her, she scrambled to her feet. I'd better give them another song, something more cheerful. She smiled and nodded towards another group of wealthy gentlemen milling around the nearest bookstall. She began to sing again, and the men gathered around and reached into their pockets. Peasel had never been inside the castle before, and though he was truly impressed by the lofty battlements and the smoke-blackened towers, he wished at this moment that he could be anywhere else on the planet. The two soldiers marched him up the winding cobbled road into the very heart of the fortifications, past endless stone barracks, cannons and cooking fires. The castle hadn't seen a battle for half a century, but it was still a military garrison, and kilted recruits and officers in bright tartan trews and scarlet jackets stared as the pickpocket was escorted past. The air pulsed with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of shouted orders. "What are you going to do to me?" he asked one of the soldiers timidly. "If it were up to me, lad, I'd possibly just shoot you," he replied with a thick brogue. "But it's to the dungeons I'm taking you." "The dungeons?" Peasel squealed and quickly regained his composure. Panicking wasn't going to help this situation. "I thought they were only for prisoners of war." "That they are," the soldier replied. "But we're not at war with anyone at present, and as it happens, there's a couple of men down there from the town council, so I reckon I'll just hand yous over to them." He motioned with his bayonet towards an oak doorway set in a tower wall, and the other soldier pushed Peasel through. Behind the door, a steep staircase wound into the bowels of the castle, and the soldiers' tackety boots clattered on the stone as they followed Peasel round and down, past cold, gaping chambers fortified with iron bars. In the darkness, some of the vaults, Peasel could hear murmuring in some language he didn't understand. "Dutch smugglers," said the talkative man. "Can't understand a bloody word they're saying." The trio eventually arrived at the long corridor lit by thick, acrid candles. A group of men, 2 soldiers, 2 civilians were clustered around a table, cluttered with paper, trying to read in the flickering light. "Shh! The tunnel doesn't show up on any of these charts we have." A soldier with a giant walrus moustache barked. The civilians gave a little jump. "There's no telling where it might lead. Might be a few feet or it might lead right under our defences." "Yes, Sergeant," the other soldier, an officer of some sort, folded his hand behind his back. "We simply have to find out where it goes. Can't fit any of our men in there, you say?" "No, sir." Civilians winced again. "Not even Private Hemingway, and he lost his legs at Waterloo." The sergeant thought for a second before adding, "And an arm." The officer sighed. The sergeant turned to Peasel and his guards. "What are you doing with that boy, Private McSorry?" "Caught him stealing, sir. Wallets. Up on the esplanade." "That's not a military matter, Private," said the officer brusquely. "I know, sir. And I thought since there were 2 members of the town council here, I'd bring him to him." The councillors, dressed in identical breeches and frock coats, looked up from the charts. "It's not our concern, soldier," said one. "Deliver him to the town guards. He'll most likely be tried by the magistrate on Monday." The officer stroked his moustache thoughtfully before speaking. "What will happen to the boy?" "It's a serious charge, pickpocketing, if he was caught red-handed." The councillor went back to studying the charts. "He'll be deported to a penal colony in Australia, like as not." Peasel raised his hand. "Actually, I was just testing these fine soldiers' power of observation, and very alert they were too. I was going to put the money back." "Don't even bother, lad." The officer crouched down beside Peasel and put a hand on his shoulder. "But there might be a way we could forget this whole incident." "Oh, I don't think that's possible." The councillor looked up again. "I broke the law." "What I'm proposing, lad," the officer ignored the interruption, "is for you to redeem yourself by a bit of bravery. Like a little soldier, eh?" Peasel nodded enthusiastically. Not having a clue what the officer was talking about, encouraged, the man continued. "We have found a tunnel in the dungeons, lad. Didn't even know it was there, and we need to know where it goes. But it's too small for any of my men to fit in, see?" Peasel nodded again, more slowly this time. He was beginning to understand what the officer was getting at. "So if you was to have a little explore of this tunnel and tell us where it went, the army would consider it an act of patriotism, a great civic duty. Isn't that right, gentlemen?" Now the councillors were nodding as well. Private McSorry gave Peasel a thumbs-up sign. "True, a boy would be forgiven a bit of thievery if he was as patriotic as that," one councillor said slyly. "Wouldn't get sent to Australia neither." Peasel looked from one looming adult to another. They leant towards him, moustaches bristling. "All right," said the pickpocket wearily. "Show me the tunnel." Wait a minute. How will we know when he's where he's gone, the other councillor spoke. Drum, sir! Screamed the sergeant, and the councillors jumped again. There's a tiny drum in the officer's mess. It was made for Colonel Grouper's little boy before he blew his head off playing with a loaded musket. All right, sergeant, fetch the drum and the firebrand for the lad. The officer leant forward towards Peasel. We're going to make a hero out of you, son, rather than a villain, he whispered, not unkindly. Charlie sat up in bed, covered in sweat. He was still fully dressed, but his mother must have removed his shoes, put a cover over him when she'd come home. The curtains were open, and he could see the moon shining behind the spires of Edinburgh. Oh my God, the legend, he whispered to himself, remembering the rapping that he'd heard in the underground city. Peasel is the little drummer boy. Wow. Now, I didn't see that coming. Did you? I hope that you've cleaned your teeth, washed your hands, and snuggling up into bed and give yourself a great big huge cuddle because you deserve it. And I will hopefully see you tomorrow for the next chapter. Night night.